Paul Levinson, and welcome to Light On, Light Through, episode 400. And you couldn't ask for a better topic for this podcast for the 400th episode of this podcast, which I've been doing since 2006. And I just saw Martin Scorsese's Beatles 64 up yesterday on Disney Plus. I saw it late last night. It's everything you'd expect from a master like Scorsese and his masterful 1978 documentary, The Last Waltz, about the band. But Beatles 64 is much more, given what the Beatles were and are to so many millions of people on this planet. As I've been saying since the 1970s, that impact, the impact of the Beatles, will last for thousands of years, right up there with Socrates and Shakespeare, even though at one point in this documentary, a young Paul scoffs at the Beatles for having anything to do with, quote, culture, unquote. Paul prefers instead to say that what the Beatles are really about are, quote, laughs, unquote. So here are some of the highlights of Beatles 64, made possible, by the way, by some of the footage the late Albert and David Maysles brothers took of the Beatles' first trip to America. This is the subject of the documentary. Their first appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show, the concert in Washington, and the concert back in New York City in Carnegie Hall. And these are some of the highlights of Beatles 64 that had special resonance with me. I'll present them in more or less chronological order in the movie. That is, the order in which they appeared in the movie. So, a girl fan in New York City tells about the gifts she brought for each Beatle. For Ringo, it's 2, quote, science fiction books, unquote. She doesn't say which ones, but even so, it's good to hear. Another girl says Elvis, quote, is old anyway, unquote. Now, I think Elvis was great, but I completely get what she means. Yet another girl who goes to Juilliard explains that, quote, we don't usually like rock and roll, but the Beatles are the greatest, unquote. And I'll say more about Leonard Bernstein and his CBS special and his daughter Jamie for more on this point, that is, what devotees of classical music thought of the Beatles. Another important point in the movie, Ronnie Spector, interviewed, I guess about 10 or so years ago, says, quote, Murray the K was downstairs saying, you gotta get me upstairs to meet the Beatles, unquote. Now, my second published article in my life was about Murray the K. That was in the Village Voice in 1972. And by the way, my first ever published article was in 1971. I was just 24 years old, and that article was about Paul McCartney defending him from the myopic critic Robert Christgau's absurd review of one of McCartney's solo albums, and that was published in 1971. And I even wrote a song about Murray the K that he indeed played on his WNBC AM radio show. Now, Beatles 64 had a lot more to say about Murray, and I'll talk about that a little further on in the podcast. Let me also mention that make sure you check out the show notes to this podcast episode, because you'll find URLs and links to all of these articles and the song about Murray the K that I just mentioned. Here's another point. I loved seeing the Ronettes hold the Phil Spector Christmas album, which has 2 recordings by the Ronettes. I saw Mommy kissing Santa Claus and Frosty the Snowman. Well, obviously, the Ronettes sound a lot better than I do singing that song. And I play both of those all the time on YouTube. Here's another point in the documentary that really struck me. A nasty NYPD cop tells two girls to get off the floor the Beatles were on. This is in their hotel. And the cop says to the girls, "Get out of here. Get down those stairs before, quote, I throw you down the stairs, unquote." This is like typical bravado, unnecessary bravado of, unfortunately, not only New York cops, but especially New York cops, but cops all over the world. And I couldn't help thinking of the unfortunate parallel of that incident in New York to the London Bobbies who go up to the roof to break up the Beatles' last concert that we see in Peter Jackson's The Beatles Get Back. By the way, it's also on Disney Plus, and it's now a perfect pair with the Beatles 64. Another point, black teenage girls love the Beatles. Black teenage boys do not. And one of them says, quote, "I think the Beatles are disgusting," unquote. But Smokey Robinson feels differently. I'll talk about him in a few minutes, or actually a few seconds. But let's get back to Murray the K. He appears throughout the movie. The Beatles tend to think he's too, quote, loud, unquote. John mocks him in the movie, and George Harrison remarks in an interview, probably conducted in the mid-1980s, that Murray, in effect, just glommed onto the Beatles in their first visit to New York. Now, believe it or not, I actually worked with Murray the K in the 1970s. He invited me to come work with him after he read that 1972 article about him in the Village Voice that I just told you about. And you know what? I didn't find him too loud at all. I guess he had mellowed by then. Let's get back to Smokey Robinson. He does an endearing performance of McCartney's Yesterday in the 1960s. Of course, the song was written and recorded by McCartney in the 1960s, but I'm saying that Smokey did his rendition of Yesterday in the 1960s. And in a very recent interview, Smokey explains that the Beatles had a tender, feminine way of expressing their emotions, which Smokey Robinson found very admirable. Jamie Bernstein, by the way, Leonard's daughter, and Betty Friedan echo and elaborate on this perceptive view. Clips from Leonard Bernstein's path-breaking 1967 CBS show on the Beatles and the rock revolution appear throughout Scorsese's film, and there'll be a link to my review of Maestro. This was a biopic about Leonard that came out literally about a year ago, and amazingly, it said nothing about that fabulous 1967 TV show. It had all kinds of great bits. Bernstein showed how She Said goes from 3/4 to 4/4, and all kinds of great little musical insights that someone like Bernstein would appreciate, and he communicates to us. Back to Murray the K, I have to also say that a very fascinating little scene, at least a scene that I enjoyed. He gets George in 1964 to introduce James Ray's song recording, Got My Mind Set on You. But unsaid in the movie is that, of course, George would have a big hit singing that very song in 1987. Got my mind set on you. Yeah, that was a great song. Look, I guess Murray at least deserves a little credit for introducing the song to George. Marshall McLuhan appears a lot in the second half of the movie, saying things like, quote, JFK was the first TV president, unquote, and interviewing John and Yoko in Toronto at the end of 1969. I worked with Marshall McLuhan at the end of the following decade. He was the real thing, the most perceptive scholar I've ever had the chance and the pleasure to work with. And you can read more of my views on McLuhan. I published a couple of books about McLuhan, Digital McLuhan, way back in 1999, and much more recently, a shorter book, McLuhan in an Age of Social Media, which I continually update. Now, Beatles 64 sets up the Beatles coming to America as the immediate sequence and desperately needed healing musical salve to the crushing depression caused by JFK's assassination, which indeed it was. And Harry Benson, now a 94-year-old photographer, tells us that Lennon, quote, used to speak of all things about Lee Harvey Oswald. He was worried about violence, unquote, directed against him and the Beatles in America. And I have to tell you, that brought me to tears. And I say a lot more about John Lennon's assassination and how it brought me to write my latest novel, Its Real Life, an Alternate History of the Beatles, in the interview that Evan Levine did with me just last week. And again, I'll have links to all of these things, the novel and the interview and so on, in the show notes. But on a lighter note, speaking of tears, I had to laugh when I heard that, quote, George Harrison was near tears, unquote, when he and the Beatles were dissed at a reception for them at the British Embassy after their Washington, D.C. concert. Paul McCartney had a much better response. But I'm trying to keep this podcast, well, at least a little on the clean side, so I won't tell you what McCartney says in the movie. But also on a lighter note, and putting on my media theorist hat, I was pleased to hear that the word cassette, long before there were little tape recordings, back in 1964, used to describe a place that cans of soda inhabited. When someone said in Beatles 64, quote, draw it, the soda can, out of the cassette, unquote. But the documentary returns to the assassination of JFK, which, along with the assassination of John Lennon, were the worst public events in my life. At the end of the movie, satirist and critic Joe Queenan, who appears throughout the film, tells us that his, quote, father never recovered from Kennedy's assassination, but we did, unquote. And the reason for that was we had the Beatles. And the we is, of course, my generation. And what Queenan says is all the more trenchant, since he earlier tells us that his father beat him and also decreed that young Queenan couldn't watch the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, which Queenan said was worse than being beaten. But he managed to watch it at his uncle's place. Well, look, I could say much more about this documentary, but I think you get the picture. And if you loved or love the Beatles and feel the same about Peter Jackson's The Beatles Get Back, well, see this movie, Beatles 64, at least once.
The Light on Light Through podcast.
And I hope you enjoyed that review of Beatles 64. I will be back here soon with another episode of Light On, Light Through. It was just 2 days ago that I put up my last episode. It'll probably be a little longer than 2 days before I put up my next episode. Could be another review, could be an interview. I hope it'll be something that you enjoy. In the meantime, stay safe, stay sound, and indeed enjoy life.
The Light on Light Through podcast.
Athens, 2042 AD. She ripped the paper in half, then ripped the halves, then ripped what was left again into bits and pieces of history that could have been. Sierra Waters had read once that, years ago, it was thought that men made love for the thrill, while women made love for the sense of connection it gave them.
Curled Up with a Good Book says, Sierra Waters is sexy as hell. You can find out more about The Plot to Save Socrates by Paul Levinson at theplottosavesocrates.com.
Your brilliant story, it's real life.
Paul Levinson's Silk Code, about an ancient biotech war raging on in secret for centuries.
Reading words from Paul Levinson's mind. His tales take the stage, leave the